Welcome to Press Coverage. Theo Gremminger here. No guest, doing this one solo. Got to get after it. It was the first day that we had free agent information just pouring in at a rapid pace. Got to record a special edition of Press Coverage to go over all the winners and losers from this huge amount of free agent signings, as well as reacting to some of the trades that we've seen over the last few days. This was like supposed to be a drip, slow build up, but it was anything but that. Last week was super busy. This weekend was busy. Sunday was busy. It felt like there was a fantasy football move happening every single day. And then today, we used to have legal tampering. Now it's like a negotiating period. Call it whatever you want. But a lot of the big names for this free agent class are already off the board. It's already off the board. This is one where these guys have cleared out. Moving forward, there are fewer names out there. There's still going to be a number of guys that could make a fantasy football impact that are out there on the market. There's still a number of guys where a trade could occur and that certain player could make a fantasy football impact. But we have a lot of clarity about the quarterback position. We have a number of teams who have added wide receiver. We saw some running back clarity, certainly with Aaron Jones. But what we saw over the last week, give or take the last 9 days, go back to when the Deebo trade went down, it's going to have effect on the NFL draft. It's going to have an effect on the trade market, and it's going to have an effect on what players are in your lineup this season. And we need to keep an open mind with free agent signings. When players switch teams, we can't cite last year's stats. You can in a sense, but you have to have an open mind for players taking on a larger role, a more prominent role, a featured role at times. There were guys that were sort of left for dead in fantasy football, guys you would have never had in your lineup in 2023 that ended up signing with a team and being fantasy considerations in 2024. You saw it with Jonnu Smith. Jonnu Smith signed with Miami, ends up having a career year. You saw it with Darnell Mooney, who at times was a very valuable streamer for you. And that's not even counting all the guys who came in and were huge impacts in fantasy. Guys you expected, like Saquon Barkley, Derrick Henry, Josh Jacobs, guys you expected to make fantasy impacts. Those guys all beat their ADP. Then we had Sam Darnold coming in and putting up QB1 numbers. This was actually back-to-back years you saw quarterbacks switch teams that the marketplace was not excited about, and they both sort of outkicked their coverage in terms of fantasy production. We saw this 2 seasons ago. Baker Mayfield ends up signing with Tampa as Tom Brady's quote-unquote replacement, and Baker Mayfield has put up back-to-back QB1 seasons. So when players switch teams, we have to have an open mind in fantasy. And people who are dismissing these guys and saying, I'm never going to draft them, that's sort of a sucker's take, because we don't want to overdraft a guy because he's a free agent. But when a team shows that they like somebody and they're actually telling the truth, and how do NFL teams tell the truth? 2 ways: the money they spend and the draft capital they put on you. There's really very few other ways where they have to tell the truth. NFL draft, they tell the truth. And they tell the truth with what they do contract-wise, what they do with trades, what they do with free agent signings. That's pretty much it. So we have to have an open mind to a lot of these players. And we had a lot of action today. Let's start talking about some of the moves that we had last week, or not necessarily last week, but over the last few days. You can't even keep up. There's so much. Got to talk about Deebo Samuel. Deebo Samuel gets traded to the Washington Commanders. And this is one where Deebo last year, it's sort of like Deebo was sort of slipping in San Francisco. This was a player that had some big games at the beginning of the year and then was not a player that we could trust in our lineup for a good portion of the season. Opens up the year with 2 18-point games. And yeah, I know in week 16 he had 25 points, but there were 6 straight games where Deebo scored 6 points or fewer. And before that, it was not much better. It was back-to-back 12-point weeks. So Deebo last year sort of had a regression in terms of his fantasy football production. And this has been a guy that's been outstanding for fantasy for multiple years. But he went from averaging 21 points in his vintage year in 2021 down to 13 in 2022, then goes with 16 in 2023, terrific in 2023, down to 10 last year. So 10 points per game in PPR, that's nothing you really get excited about in your lineup. But now Deebo ends up on a team in Washington where you can paint a picture for Deebo returning to like a 2022 numbers, like a 13 point per game season, maybe giving you high-end wide receiver 3 production, maybe being in your flex. And with Washington, he's going to play on one of the best offenses in football with a quarterback that legitimately is an MVP candidate right now in Jayden Daniels. So what did Washington lack last year? They lacked players who could do things with the ball in their hands and get yak. They weren't a yak team at all. None of those guys were providing yak numbers. What else is Washington lacking? A wide receiver 2. They just got a wide receiver 2 in Deebo Samuel. We also saw Dyami Brown headed to Jacksonville, which doesn't really do anything for fantasy, but it's another wide receiver gone in Washington. So guys like Dyami Brown, guys like Olamide Zacchaeus were on the field for Washington last year. They replaced them with Deebo Samuel. What else did we see last year from Washington with Cliff Kingsbury's first year? Jayden Daniels was a huge fantasy football success story, but there was another couple of players who made impacts that the fantasy community were sort of leaving for dead. How about Zach Ertz? Zach Ertz was not a guy a year ago at this time who anybody thought would do anything. I certainly didn't have Zach Ertz high, but Zach Ertz ended up being very, very impactful. He also re-signs with Washington. And we saw Austin Eckler, who declined big time in LA, end up signing with Washington and having usable fantasy weeks last year. So the old guys end up in Washington. They get attached with this dynamic young quarterback in a scheme that's friendly, and they produce. So next year, I think Deebo Samuel, again, has a chance to return to his 2022 numbers, 13 points per game, somewhere in that wheelhouse. This is a really good one. Then we add in Washington makes a trade, goes out and gets Laramie Tunsil. And Laramie Tunsil, again, a terrific offensive tackle from Houston. So Washington over the last few days has added Deebo Samuel, gets Jayden Daniels a wide receiver 2 with yak ability, and then goes out and gets a big-time offensive tackle. Not sure the exact numbers they're paying, but it's going to be a number of draft picks for Tunsil if I had to predict it. I haven't seen the exact numbers there, but Washington, a big winner. Jayden Daniels, a big winner. And Deebo Samuel, sort of a bailout spot for him. Really, really like what Washington has done. I don't think they're done yet. This is a team where I think they're going to add another offensive piece, whether that's at running back, whether it's another wide receiver. I don't think they're done yet. They know what they have in Jayden Daniels. They're going to push the chips in and try to go for it. They made it all the way to the NFC Championship game last year. This is a team that has aspirations to win big, and they're certainly showing that with some of their moves early on in this offseason. Another player who was on the move, Geno Smith. And this is one where everything sort of moved quickly. Geno wanted a new contract. Seattle wasn't going to pay it. Geno requests a trade, and boom, Geno Smith shipped off to Vegas. This is a huge, huge, huge fantasy ramifications type move here. Let's talk about Geno, because Geno Smith had some very, very good performances when he was in Seattle. This is a player who was never really looked at as anything, was looked at as just sort of the Russell Wilson replacement because of just the happenstances. Like, Russ is gone. They have a veteran in Geno. They go with Geno. He was viewed as a bridge quarterback. It was supposed to be a one-year thing for Geno. Geno turned it into 3 years as a starting quarterback. 2022, Geno finishes as quarterback 8 in points per game. Was a huge winner that year in terms of a guy that wasn't drafted, but finished as the QB8. If you had him in Superflex, you were happy you had Geno. The next year gets 15.7 points per game. And then last year, QB15 at 16.5 points per game. I think about QB15 is about where we should treat Geno in Vegas. I think he's a mid to high-end QB2, impactful potentially in Superflex, on your waiver wire or your backup in your redraft leagues. But when it comes to Vegas, this is a team where they're trying to win in Vegas. They hired Pete Carroll, and Pete Carroll is not a, hey, let's go rebuild. It's going to be a 10-year process. No, Pete Carroll is old. Pete Carroll wants to win right now. Then they make this move to get Pete Carroll, his former quarterback in Seattle, in Geno Smith. So Geno's best year in Seattle was with Pete Carroll in Seattle. And we get Chip Kelly as the offensive coordinator. Chip Kelly is synonymous with pushing the pace and running a lot of plays. Chip Kelly had tremendous success in Philly early on and was sort of a innovator in terms of some of the offensive schemes. Chip Kelly's also coming off of a national title win at Ohio State as their offensive coordinator. Of course, before then, he was the UCLA offensive coordinator. This has been a guy that's been around for a while. But again, Chip Kelly is not a guy who's coming to the NFL to lead some long-term turnaround and sort of these are coaches who want to win right now. And I think Vegas wants to win right now. They pay Max Crosby. They turned down Seattle. They could have had Geno and DK Metcalf for Max Crosby. Of course, they make the smart decision, keep Max Crosby one of the better defensive ends in football. So they have some impactful players on defense. Antonio Pierce had them very competitive in a lot of games. It was sort of a team that they always sort of seemed to play teams tight, and there was a lot of like close losses. This is a team that I think could be on the brink. They have one of the best tight ends, if not the best tight end in football, in Brock Bowers. They have Jacoby Myers, a very, very solid wide receiver. Now they add Geno Smith. Vegas also has the number 6 overall pick, and they have an early second-round pick. Now, this Geno Smith trade makes me think we might hear the name Ashton Genty when Vegas selects at 6. We might hear the name Tet McMillan when Vegas selects at 6. They also could choose to address running back in the early second round. Potentially, there's 2 Ohio State running backs who are attached to Chip Kelly in Travion Henderson and Quinshon Judkins, who should both get top 45 draft capital and are both really, really good NFL prospects at running back. So the Geno Smith trade makes me think that Vegas is going to keep going with this. Vegas is trying to win this year. Vegas wants to make the playoffs. You saw Jim Harbaugh get to LA, make the playoffs in year 1, turn things around really quickly off the Brandon Staley era. You could see the same thing happen in Vegas with Pete Carroll taking over for Antonio Pierce and winning right away. Pete won a lot of games in Seattle. Pete won a Super Bowl. This is a coach that wants to win, and this is a coach that, for better or for worse, went out and got arguably, probably, actually the best quarterback on the market in Geno Smith. I think if Geno Smith was a free agent, the market would have been really pretty aggressive for him based on some of the other guys that were available that we're going to talk about soon. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're talking about DK Metcalf, who is now a Pittsburgh Steeler.
Rookie. It's all about rookie talk in fantasy football right now. So why not go use all that knowledge to do something other than a mock draft? Chris Jimino won $8,000 with just 2 teams last year, and each draft took 5 minutes. That's pretty good ROI. You can start doing rookie drafts for money today on Fast Draft. The Origins tournament is live. It is the place to go and monetize your knowledge of rookies and use your favorite player profiler host promo code for a $25 deposit match. Now let's go start drafting faster.
Welcome back, Theo Gremminger, talking about free agents and trades. We talked about Geno Smith in Vegas, but that was certainly not the biggest trade. I think that the biggest trade that went down, DK Metcalf. DK Metcalf goes to Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh gives him an absolute fortune, extends him, gives him like $150 million. So again, DK Metcalf, this is one where DK Metcalf is 27 years old. He is not turning 28 until this time next year. So this is a player that Pittsburgh views as a huge addition for their offense. DK this year went down to 12.8 points per game. DK this year took a backseat to Jackson Smith and Jigba in terms of the hierarchy in Seattle for the higher scoring wide receiver. We've seen it with DK in other years where, he either outscored Tyler Lockett or he was neck and neck with Tyler Lockett. DK is a player that there's some polarization in the community for how they view DK. DK has one season in his career where he averaged more than 15 points per game. He had a 17-point per game season way back in 2020. And since then, he's been the wide receiver 20, the wide receiver 24, the wide receiver 22, and then this past year, the wide receiver 30. But again, like we talked about, having an open mind to players when they get to new teams and new teams make their move on these guys, DK's there. DK has a chance to have the best season he's had as a pro. And I think that that's sort of not just wishful thinking. That's not me saying, I want DK Metcalf to do well. I don't have bags and bags of DK in Dynasty. In fact, this past year, I talked about DK as a Dynasty sell. I think right now, I would kind of wish I could go back on that statement a little bit, because when it comes to Pittsburgh, there's a popular narrative now going out there that this is not a good landing spot for DK because George Pickens and him are going to split targets. This move makes me think George Pickens might be gone soon. George Pickens is going to be a free agent next offseason. I don't see them paying George Pickens when they just paid DK this absolute fortune. And those two are both big outside alpha wide receivers. Could they coexist next to one another? Sure. But when you factor in the contract you'd have to pay George Pickens in order to do that, I just don't see it. So for me, I think George Pickens could be gone this offseason. And if he's not gone this offseason, he's gone next offseason. So for me, DK is the one that Pittsburgh is looking at as a long-term focal point offensive player. DK Metcalf, again, 27 years old. And when we look at the Arthur Smith offense, we have a one-year sample size in Pittsburgh. But one thing we did have last year when it came to the Arthur Smith offense was the usage that George Pickens had. And George Pickens last year, in terms of usage, gave you what you wanted to see from a wide receiver at the wide receiver position. He had a 26.5% target share. He had the sixth highest amount of air yard share in football. He was number 4 in deep targets. He was top 15 in red zone targets. So George Pickens really underperformed. He had 103 targets. I get it. We wish we would have seen more targets, but the quality of the targets and the fact that it was 103 targets in only 14 games played, I think if you put DK into this exact role, DK will perform better here than what we saw with Pickens last year. Pickens also had Justin Fields to start the year and then a quarterback change with Russell Wilson. So for me, Pittsburgh also is potentially losing Najee Harris. So this is a team that I think is going to feature DK Metcalf. I think they're going to feature him prominently. And every single year, we see a player that's traded and finishes as a wide receiver 1. We even saw it last year. Jerry Jeudy finishes as a wide receiver 1. The Pittsburgh Steelers believe DK Metcalf is their guy. Despite Arthur Smith, I think I'm kind of in on DK Metcalf. And I didn't think I'd be on this for 6 months ago. So anybody who saw me saying to sell DK Metcalf in Dynasty, I didn't know. I didn't know he was getting $150 million in Pittsburgh. And I think that this is one where there's a little bit of a clarity. We'll have way more clarity when we see a quarterback in Pittsburgh. And I'm going to go ahead and project this one. This is like one of those, like you're watching an election show or something and they're going to project a state. I'm projecting the Pittsburgh Steelers to get Aaron Rodgers. So you guys let me know if this one doesn't fall through. I'll look stupid. But it sounds like there's enough steam there that Aaron Rodgers will end up being a Pittsburgh Steeler. So Aaron Rodgers ends up being a Pittsburgh Steeler. This makes a little bit more sense because, when you talk about Rodgers, he's going to take shots. He's going to force it. He's going to hyper target a guy in the red zone. He is going to pass up giving the ball to a running back on the 5-yard line in order to target a wide receiver. Saw it a million times with Davante Adams. And DK is not peak Davante Adams. Don't get it twisted. You're not going to get that Davante Adams type ceiling there. But I think with Aaron Rodgers in Pittsburgh, this trade makes more sense. Pittsburgh gets DK Metcalf. They also potentially get Aaron Rodgers. And if he does have George Pickens and DK, that's something we can sort of work with. So Aaron Rodgers, I'm projecting signs with the Pittsburgh Steelers. again, things go poorly, but you've got some insiders and people connected with the team that say this is really close to happening. It might even happen by the time this podcast airs. Again, I'm recording this a little bit earlier on the day on Monday, so we don't have the final clarification on this. There's a couple of dominoes that need to fall, but for Rodgers to completely end up there. But it sounds to me like Rodgers is a Pittsburgh Steeler. Now, Rodgers last year in New York, this is not a guy we want to use in fantasy. Rodgers lost his fastball. Like it's not as good. But I do think that the continuity in Pittsburgh, the offensive line's improving in Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh's the team that made the playoffs last year. I think the expectations are going to be a little bit higher than New York. New York was a train wreck last year, too. You know, we end up seeing Robert Saleh fired mid-season. We had end up seeing the offensive coordinator fired. Like, this was a train wreck. Pittsburgh has stability. Arthur Smith returns. Mike Tomlin is one of the best coaches we've seen in the last, 10, 15 years in the NFL. I'm not going to say modern era. Somebody's going to call me out and say you're ridiculous to that statement. But Mike Tomlin is a Hall of Fame coach on the sidelines now. Sort of with Bill Belichick gone, he's sort of the recognizable coach in the NFL. Mike Tomlin is a big voice in the locker room and certainly a guy that commands a team. That's a good fit for Rodgers. I think that they can coexist. So I hope this goes down. I hope this is finalized, especially because I'm projecting it. So I don't want to look foolish here. But Rodgers to Metcalf, that sort of makes sense to me. Let's talk about Rodgers' teammate. Let's talk about Davante Adams. And Davante Adams, this is one where what a turn of events here. Like Matt Stafford was rumored to be going to another team. And this was one where we heard he was going to get traded. There was all this, Matt Stafford's wife kind of talks about how frustrated she is on like a podcast. And then they make up. They restructure the deal. Matt Stafford gets the bag. And then a couple of days later, we hear that the LA Rams get Davante Adams. And of course, they signed him before a number of other guys because Adams was cut from the New York Jets. So this is a huge one. And if we look at the role that Cooper Kupp had last year, so Puka Nacua has taken over in LA. Puka Nacua is that guy. Puka Nacua is the wide receiver one here. Davante Adams, again, 32 years old. This is a guy that is older, but Davante Adams also played at a high level last year. Davante Adams averaged 17 points per game last season. So we talk about DK Metcalf's best season ever as a pro back in 2020. Davante Adams had that last year as a 31-year-old in New York. Davante Adams, of course, had a very high level of success in Vegas. He had 3 straight years with 160-plus targets there. That's not even to mention all the tremendous success he had in Green Bay. So Davante Adams is like an unbelievably successful fantasy player. But I think the closeout of his career, this is a great landing spot. And when we look at the Cooper Kupp role that Davante Adams will be stepping into, Cooper Kupp last year had a 26% target share. Cooper Kupp had slot snaps of like 56%. So I think Davante, as he gets older, he sort of projects to become the Larry Fitzgerald. Think of like the older Larry Fitzgerald, where Larry Fitzgerald had very successful years as an older player in Arizona. That's sort of the pathway Davante Adams is headed to. My co-host at School of Scott over at Fantasy Point, Scott Barrett, shout out to him. I stole that reference, but that was a really good one by Scott. So this is the Larry Fitzgerald moment for Davante Adams in his career. And if he just steps into that Cooper Kupp role, that's really, really good for him. You're talking about a guy where Davante Adams can be a wide receiver 2 with Puka Nacua finishing as a wide receiver 1. And if we recall, there was multiple weeks last year where Kupp and Nacua both ate. The two would combine for like 65% of the targets, 50% of the targets, 60% of the targets. Like the two of them combined for a very high combined teammate target share. So I love the Davante Adams in the Cooper Kupp role. I think that's really, really exciting for us in fantasy. I think Matt Stafford is a sneaky value in Superflex. Like that one a lot. Another sneaky trade that went down, Christian Kirk is a Houston Texan. And it feels like last year. It feels like last year, doesn't it? Joe Mixon was sort of forgotten. Joe Mixon was a guy that was supposed to get cut. The whole story was the Bengals are about to cut Joe Mixon. Then like 24 hours later, like, you know what? Instead of cutting him, we traded him to Houston for a 7th round pick. And the fantasy community was like, whatever, Joe Mixon, you're in the dead zone. We like the Houston offense, but you're kind of the forgotten man. Let me go get some Nico Collins. Let me get some Stephon Diggs. Let me get some Tank Dell, and let me get some CJ Stroud. And then what happened? Joe Mixon 8 and 8 and 8. So Houston identified a mispriced player on the open market, trade a 7th-round pick for him, and had fantasy success out of it. Now they go and trade a 7th-round pick for Christian Kirk. Christian Kirk in the Stephon Diggs role is what I'm projecting. And Stephon Diggs last year averaged 15 points per game in this low ADOT role, like super low ADOT, but he thrived in it. It was Nico Collins, Tank Dell, and Stephon Diggs. Diggs badly outscored Tank Dell and Nico Collins, wide receiver 1, but Stephon Diggs only played, a small portion of the year, about half the season, but it was still 15 points per game. So for me, Christian Kirk in that role, that's pretty good right there. Christian Kirk, if we recall, had fantasy success. He was a wide receiver 1 his first year in Jacksonville, then was playing very well last year before getting injured, and then finished the year sort of poorly. And then now he's on the way out. So Christian Kirk has a chance to rebound in that Stephon Diggs role. This was a sneaky move by the Houston Texans to add another receiver. And remember, Tank Dell probably not going to play the entire season next year. Stephon Diggs still could return to Houston, but my bet would be Diggs is elsewhere. Want my Stephon Diggs prediction? You probably do. Stephon Diggs goes to Dallas, plays with his brother. That's just my prediction. I could be wrong on that one. We're not really talking about it. Keep this thing going. Let's talk about another player. We talked about the Jets, talked about Davante Adams, talked about Aaron Rodgers. Let's talk about the new quarterback, Justin Fields. Now, this one is nuanced. So Justin Fields, obviously a winner here. Justin Fields is a player that over his last, and this stat, I had to triple check this one. This one was I had to go back and triple check it a million times because I didn't want to say the wrong thing. But in Justin Fields' last 24 starts, so that's over the last 3 seasons, because last year he started only about 6 games. And then, of course, he didn't play full seasons the 2 seasons prior. He missed a couple of games here and there. So 24 games over the last 3 years that he started. He has 11 top 5 QB finishes. Think about that again. Justin Fields has 11 top 5 weekly QB finishes over his last 24 games played. And why is that? Because Justin Fields is one of the better scrambling quarterbacks, one of the better running quarterbacks in the league when he's behind center, period. End of story. Justin Fields has over 2,600 rushing yards as a pro. That's 23rd all-time in NFL history. Justin Fields now signs a 2-year, $40 million deal with the New York Jets. Now, I like this one for Justin Fields a lot because I think this is a perfect bridge situation for him. The contract is team friendly. They end up getting potentially 2 years out of Fields. Now, there's a chance that New York gets one of the quarterbacks in the NFL draft. That could sort of throw this plan into whack. If they fall in love with a Jackson Dart or they make a move up for a Cam Ward or a Shedeur Sanders, I don't think that it happens with the previous 2 guys. I think that the way that everything sort of shifted with these last 36 hours, these last week of signings and trades, I think that Cam Ward goes number 1 to Tennessee or the New York Giants if the Giants trade up. I think that of Tennessee and New York, one of them probably goes in potentially with a Russell Wilson as a bridge, but it's going to be Cam Ward to one of those 2 teams. Either New York trades up to 1 or Tennessee just stays on the board and selects Cam Ward. And then I think Shedeur Sanders is your quarterback of the Cleveland Browns. And there's potential that a Kirk Cousins or something comes in the mix as a bridge quarterback till they're ready. But I think when it comes to Shedeur Sanders and Cam Ward, those guys are what they are. If an NFL team likes them enough to draft them the first 2 picks, they probably start game 1. Then when you get down to pick 7 with the Jets, the Raiders filled their QB need at 6. They're not going to draft a quarterback after trading for Geno, not with this coaching staff. So at 7 overall, do the New York Jets fall in love with Jackson Dart? They still could take him and have him sit behind Justin Fields. But I don't think that happens. I think more likely than not, next year, your quarterbacks in New York are going to be Justin Fields being backed up by Tyrod Taylor. And I think you're going to see a lot of quarterback design runs. And I think Justin Fields becomes a viable quarterback pick for fantasy managers that want to wait at the quarterback position. Again, 11 top 5 weekly finishes in his last 24 games started as a pro. Want to fact check this one. This is 4-point passing touchdowns only. It goes down slightly in 6-point passing touchdown weeks, but Justin Fields, 2,600 rushing yards as a pro. He's 23rd all time in quarterback rushing yards. He is a threat to have 800, 900 rushing yards next year. That's in the wheelhouse. And if he does that, you're talking about Jayden Daniels type rushing yards. Maybe not Lamar, but if you had to bet money on it, Justin Fields would be top 3 in quarterback rushing yardage next year in the NFL. That insulates his fantasy floor. This is a guy with the Konami code ability that we're always searching for in fantasy football. Justin Fields, we also have a sample size of him putting up numbers. This year, when he got benched in Pittsburgh, he was like quarterback 6. So like the whole Pittsburgh run this year wasn't perfect, but he was still like quarterback 6, and he had a QB1 week in that mix before they went to Russell Wilson. So Justin Fields, obviously a winner for him. Now, what does it do to the rest of the New York Jets skill position players? It's mixed. It's not good for Breece Hall. And anybody who says it's good for Breece Hall, I don't think they're thinking clearly, because Breece Hall is a player where we love the talent. Breece Hall is a guy where we love the talent. I mean, he was RB2 overall 2 seasons ago. He was unbelievable as a rookie in terms of a points per game average and the impact he had on the team. So Breece Hall as a rookie plays 7 games, gets 16.4 points per game. Then heading into 2023, ends up becoming a value in drafts. But how did Breece Hall finish as the RB2 overall and the RB6 in points per game in 2023? He had 76 receptions and he had 591 receiving yards. So like Breece Hall finishes as the RB2 in 2023, but he did so with only 994 rushing yards. And again, that was a team that had its issues. And certainly Aaron Rodgers went down for the season. It was like Zach Wilson. It was sort of a mess. But Breece Hall had his vintage season as a pro in year 2, 17.1 points per game. Then last year, what happens? Breece Hall goes down to 15 points per game. And why did he go down to 15 points per game? Because his receptions went down to 57, because Aaron Rodgers didn't pass to him as much. And Breece Hall also had some inconsistent usage. So there was usage and the receptions. But I think we can all agree that Breece Hall's best possible outcome would have been a quarterback that would have targeted him out of the backfield and got him back to the 70 reception total. Now, Justin Fields is a lot of things, but Justin Fields is not a check down to the running back quarterback. So devil's advocate, Theo, you're stupid. You don't know ball. A scrambling quarterback is going to open up running lanes for Breece Hall, and Breece Hall is going to have his first 1,000-yard rushing season as a pro, and he's going to rip off all these long runs, because I've seen Breece Hall have all these explosive runs, and that's true. Breece Hall is explosive, but you've taken away one of the outs he has to get back to like top 3 scoring at the running back position. So for me, do I think Breece Hall is a RB1 next year? Sure. I think Breece Hall is probably an RB1 next year. But do I think Breece Hall is a top 3 scorer at the running back position? Do I think he's going to go out and score as many fantasy points as Saquon Barkley? No. Do I think he's going to score as many fantasy points as Jahmyr Gibbs? No. Bijan Robinson? No. Devon Achane? No. So now we start going down the list. And now we're saying Breece Hall needs to overcome not getting targets out of the backfield, and he needs to step it up as a runner and be the most efficient he's ever ran in his career. So for me, Breece Hall, somewhere in that running back 6 through 12 range, a second-round pick in redraft, not a first-round pick in redraft. You're staying away from him in the first round, and I don't think the market's even going to reflect it. I think Breece Hall could end up being a value at the 2-3 turn in redraft, but again, that's not really what you want to hear if you're a Breece Hall manager in Dynasty. Now, what about Garrett Wilson? Now, Garrett Wilson's a funny one, because a lot of people are ready to bury Garrett Wilson, and they like Breece Hall in this situation. I kind of have it flipped around. I don't really see much of a change with Garrett Wilson. Garrett Wilson last year had 100 catches. He had 1,100 receiving yards, set career marks in both. And over the last 3 years, he's had at least 147 targets every single year. Now, Davante Adams is gone. Tyler Conklin is probably gone. Breece Hall's not going to get targeted. So Justin Fields is not a quarterback that's going to have a high volume of passes. But Justin Fields supported DJ Moore to a wide receiver 6 overall finish in 2023. Then Justin Fields last year, we referenced George Pickens' usage. He had no problem hyper-targeting George Pickens at times early in the year. Now, George Pickens didn't score, but I think Garrett Wilson is a step above George Pickens in terms of his talent as a pro. And I think Garrett Wilson, I love DJ Moore, but I think Garrett Wilson's just as talented. And Garrett Wilson also, there's some room to run here because Garrett Wilson is only 24 years old. So Garrett Wilson could still have, do I think Garrett Wilson can score just as many points as he did last year? 14.8 points per game? Sure. Does Justin Fields prevent Garrett Wilson from potentially having that top 5 wide receiver season? Maybe. Probably. But I don't really change much with Garrett Wilson. This is not one where I'm looking to dump a bunch of Garrett Wilson shares. And in fact, I think if you're in a dynasty league and someone wants to just dump Garrett Wilson, I'm happy to take them off his hands if it's an 80 cents on the dollar situation. Now, people aren't stupid. People are not going to just give up on Garrett Wilson. But I do think it's a window. If you have managers in your league who just sort of don't like Justin Fields, don't like the idea of a mobile quarterback, think it's going to mess with Garrett Wilson's targets, then maybe shoot him an offer. So Garrett Wilson neutral, Breece Hall down, and Justin Fields viable for fantasy football. This is an exciting one. And another former Jet, Sam Darnold. Sam Darnold gets the bag in Seattle. Now, there's been a lot about this one. And I think that this is one where I'm not going to hate on Seattle for making this move. I'm not going to hate on it at all because Sam Darnold had a very strong season last year, and they get 7 years younger at the quarterback position with Darnold. Now, Darnold last year had his best year as a pro. And again, people are going to say, this was Justin Jefferson. This is Jordan Addison. Obviously, Aaron Jones, TJ Hawkinson, and you also had Kevin O'Connell. So you had things about as good as they could have been in terms of a position to succeed. But Sam Darnold had 35 passing touchdowns last year. He finished as a QB9 in points per game. And when it comes down to Sam Darnold, there's a little bit of parallels here with the Baker Mayfield signing in Tampa. People aren't going to like that. I'm probably going to get some comments in the chat here on YouTube and people listening on their podcast. They might not like that at all. But Sam Darnold sort of earned a contract. Geno's 34. Sam Darnold is 27. I think that this is a chance to get 7 years younger at the quarterback position. They obviously see something in Sam Darnold that they like. But when you go with Sam Darnold and you look at the metrics last year, right on Player Profiler, he was ninth in deep ball attempts. He's pushing the ball downfield. This is a player that had, he was like, when you go through it, like the air yards, 5th in air yards, he's taking shots downfield. He ends up finishing 5th in the NFL in passing yardage, though. Gets 4,300 passing yards. Now, efficiency-wise, there's some good stuff there. He was 6th in yards per attempt. He was 10th in adjusted yards per attempt. And this was a player that, again, finishes as a top 10 scorer at the quarterback position. So Sam Darnold, he's not going to be in our fantasy lineups, but this is a player that in Superflex Dynasty is a viable player for you to have as your QB2. Not necessarily ever going to be QB1, but he's 27 years old. Sam Darnold is changing the narrative of his career. He had a very, very, very strong year last year after being sort of a bust for his entire career. I think that this Seattle signing shows that they believe in him. They have Jackson Smith and Jigba. They have Kenneth Walker. They have Zach Charbonnet. They have quality at the running back position. And I think 18 overall could be another wide receiver for them. Do they draft a field stretcher like Matthew Golden? I think that might end up being the outcome here. They're also going to address the tight end position. So I think Seattle is not done yet this offseason, but I'll say that this is certainly a win for Sam Darnold. Get this long-term stability. Obviously, it's not as good a situation as Minnesota, but people sort of being critical about the amount of money Sam Darnold got, he deserved it. The guy earned it last year. And at the end of the day, 27 years old, 35 touchdown passes last year, over 4,000 passing yards, Now he's got long-term stability. And Clint Kubiak, I think, is going to be a fantasy-friendly offensive coordinator for him. So Darnold's never going to be in our lineup in redraft 12 in like non-superflex, but in superflex leagues, keep an eye on him, especially if people are looking to get out and they think they're sharp by just selling Sam Darnold. So that's an interesting one. Mike Gesicki re-signs with the Cincinnati Bengals. And this one, not really anything to talk about here, but Gesicki's one where the market sort of wasn't really looking at him at all. I wonder if he can take a step forward in year 2. We saw him really step up when T. Higgins missed time and have a bunch of useful weeks. Anybody who watch my waiver wire shows, listen to my waiver wire podcast, Gesicki was the name we talked about, and then he had a really strong run. Then T. Higgins returned, and Gesicki took a step back. So does Gesicki have a little more consistency in year 2 with Cincinnati? There's a chance it happens. But I think one thing that this indicates to me for people that are NFL draft fans is Cincinnati was a team that was sort of linked to guys like Tyler Warren and Colston Loveland as a potential dark horse to take them inside the first round. I don't think so. I think that they probably pass and they go on the defensive side of the ball. This is sort of a team in transition here. They also signed Samaje Perine. So I think today Chase Brown is a winner from free agency because Chase Brown, instead of getting a scary backup that could take away some of his usage, gets 29-year-old Samaje Perine. So the Bengals are going to look the same next year on offense, which is a really good thing for us in fantasy. Now, certainly T. Higgins looks very likely to be back. They put the tag on him. A team would have to give up 2 firsts for T. Higgins. I don't think that's happening. So for me, Cincinnati, Chase Brown, a big winner. Gesicki, sort of one to keep an eye on, and a best ball type pick for you. Chris Godwin. This is another big domino that was potentially going to fall, was Chris Godwin. And apparently the New England Patriots made a substantial offer to get Chris Godwin, and he left money on the table with New England in order to come back and play in Tampa Bay. Now, Chris Godwin was just fantastic last year. Chris Godwin, again, could have been the league winner last year at the wide receiver position. It was sort of like Rashee Rice, Chris Godwin. All these players got hurt that were like really, really playing exceptional football. But Godwin last year went back to the slot under Liam Cohen, averaged 19.7 points per game. Again, only played 7 games, but he was 19.7 points per game, which was the highest of his entire career. In 2019, Chris Godwin averaged 19.6 points per game and finished the season as the wide receiver 2. There's a chance Chris Godwin would have finished as a top 5 wide receiver this year. And he was out producing Mike Evans for those 7 games that they were healthy together. So to me, Chris Godwin, definitely this is one where Tampa Bay's a winner here. Chris Godwin, I think Chris Godwin in Tampa with Baker Mayfield, the quarterback he's thrived with, we like that more than potentially going to New England. Even though New England, he would potentially have a larger role without another wide receiver taking targets from him. The quality of the Tampa Bay offense, this is a team who averaged like 29 points a game last year. And people saying, Liam Cohen's gone, Theo. Like, I don't know if you saw that one. Liam Cohen's in Jacksonville. They promoted from within, and they promoted Josh Grizzard. And Josh Grizzard was a guy who was like the passing game coordinator. And Josh Grizzard apparently was like the play caller on a lot of like third down situations. And Grizzard, if you hear the guy talk and you hear him talk about his offense, like there's not going to be any changes from what we saw with Cohen. Maybe we see a little bit of schematic change. Maybe Grizzard uses certain players and maybe slightly tweaks it. But why get away from a good thing? I don't think you promote Grizzard if you want to change the Liam Cohen offense. And when you look at this Tampa Bay Buccaneers offense, pretty scary team right now. Bucky Irving is emerging at the running back spot, a player that we think can be an RB1 this year, dynamic talent. Rachaad White backing him up has been a very successful pro. When it comes down to backups, that's a strong situation to have. Then you look at the stability they have on the offensive line. This is a team with some very good players there. Look at Mike Evans playing at an extremely high level to end last season. Jalen McMillan was a very successful pick, 3rd-round pick, who also came on strong at the end of the season. Then you add Chris Godwin back in the mix. So you're talking about Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, and Jalen McMillan as the 3 wide receivers. Cade Otton has some continuity at tight end. Baker Mayfield back-to-back years as a QB1. A lot to like about this team. there's also a lot to like about press coverage and sticking with us. We're going to keep covering this offseason. We're going to keep getting you ready to crush your leagues this season. And we're going to keep an eye out on not only the NFL draft, but the end of this free agent period. We still have guys to talk about. We didn't talk about Najee Harris. That domino should fall. Aaron Jones goes back to Minnesota. Brandon Ayuk could be on the move at any moment. Russell Wilson, where does he sign? Tennessee, New York Giants, something like that. Daniel Jones. Daniel Jones might end up going to Indianapolis and being a potential thorn in the side of Anthony Richardson, at least give him a strong backup situation. So there's a lot more names to fall here. There's a lot more names we'll know about, but I think we covered a lot of these ones today. Make sure if you watch this on YouTube, you're subscribed to the channel here, and make sure you are giving us a like if you enjoyed this one. And if you are listening to this on a podcast, I have a new podcast over on the Fantasy Points channel, Fantasy Football Daily. I am dropping that 3-4 times a week over on the Fantasy Points channel. So check out Fantasy Football Daily, also the School of Scott over on the Fantasy Points channel, and of course, Dynasty Life over here at Player Profiler, Sonic Truth over at Player Profiler, and press coverage right here on Player Profiler. I'm everywhere. I'm Theo Gremminger. Thanks for listening to this one, and let's finish up this offseason strong. About 45 days to the NFL draft. Let's get it.
Hey, I want to thank you for being part of this broadcast. If you have any thoughts on it, leave a comment. If you enjoyed it, make sure you leave a like. And if you want to see more shows on the Player Profiler channel, subscribe to it. That's how we know you want more.